The conference room at the Heritage Foundation smelled like old money and older grudges. December air conditioning hummed through vents that cost more than most people's cars, and somewhere between the mahogany paneling and the crystal water pitchers, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez realized she'd made a terrible mistake accepting this invitation. She should have known something was wrong when the email came through. Economic Policy Roundtable Discussion, the Future of American Prosperity, Neutral Language, Academic Framing. The kind of event her staff assured her would be good optics, showing she could engage across the aisle, demonstrate bipartisan civility, all that consultant-approved nonsense that sounds good in strategy meetings but falls apart in reality. Senator John Kennedy was already seated when she arrived. That should have been the second warning sign. He wasn't checking his phone or reviewing notes like normal people do before these things. He was just sitting there, hands folded on the table, wearing that smile. The one that looks friendly in photographs, but in person feels like a threat you can't quite identify. Like a storm cloud that hasn't decided whether to rain or just ruin your picnic with its existence. Next to him sat a banker's box. Cardboard, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd see in any office. But the way Kennedy's hand rested on top of it, protective, almost affectionate, suggested this box contained something more valuable than old files. This box was ammunition. An AOC had walked into the crosshairs without even realizing the scope was trained on her. The moderator was some think tank fellow whose name didn't matter because he'd be irrelevant in about 4 minutes. He welcomed everyone, talked about civil discourse, mentioned something about finding common ground, and AOC tuned him out because she'd heard this preamble 1,000 times. She was running through her talking points: corporate greed, working families, the billionaire class. The hits that always played well on social media, generated the clips, got the retweets. Kennedy just kept smiling, kept his hand on that box. And when the moderator finally stopped talking and asked the first question, something softball about inflation and monetary policy, AOC launched into her standard response. She'd given this answer so many times she could do it on autopilot. Big corporations were raising prices not because of supply chain issues or increased costs, but because of pure greed. They were price gouging American families, extracting maximum profit while people struggled to afford groceries. The solution wasn't complex monetary policy or interest rate adjustments. It was holding these corporations accountable, maybe breaking them up, definitely taxing them more. She was about 40 seconds into this answer, hitting her rhythm, when Kennedy's hand moved, just slightly. His fingers drummed on top of that cardboard box. Tap, tap, tap. And then he spoke, his Louisiana drawl stretching words like taffy, making every syllable sound simultaneously lazy and lethal. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he said, pronouncing her name carefully, correctly, which somehow made it worse. That's real interesting, real compelling stuff. But before we get too deep into your theory about corporate greed and inflation, I wonder if you could help me with something. See, I'm just a simple country lawyer. Well, senator now, but old habits, they die hard. And I'm having some trouble following your explanation. So could you do me a favor just for clarity's sake and define inflation for me? Not what causes it, not your theory about it. Just tell everyone here what inflation actually is. The basic economic definition. The room got quieter, not silent, because the air conditioning was still humming, and somewhere a phone was vibrating against a table, but the quality of sound changed. People stopped shuffling papers. The think tank moderator's face went carefully neutral, the expression of someone who suddenly realizes they're witnessing something they'll be asked about later and wants to maintain plausible deniability. AOC blinked. The question seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. Of course she knew what inflation was. Everyone knew what inflation was. Inflation, she said, is when prices go up because corporations decide to charge more. It's driven by corporate greed and the consolidation of market power that allows companies to raise prices without competition keeping them in check. Ma'am. Kennedy's voice stayed friendly, but something shifted. He leaned forward slightly and his hand fully opened that cardboard box. That's what you think causes inflation. That's your political explanation. I asked you for the economic definition. what inflation actually is fundamentally as a monetary phenomenon. You graduated from Boston University with a degree in economics, so I know you learned this. First week of Macro 101, probably. So help me out here. What? AOC's mind raced. She knew this. Of course she knew this. Inflation was. It was the general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing power of money. That was the textbook definition. But Kennedy's tone, the way he'd phrased the question, the trap that was obviously sitting there waiting for her, made her hesitate. And in that hesitation, in that half-second pause before she could formulate the answer, Kennedy pulled the first document from his box. Let me help you out, Representative. Inflation is a persistent increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over time, resulting in a decline in the purchasing power of money. It's caused by an imbalance between the supply of money and the supply of goods, often resulting from either too much money chasing too few goods, or from increases in production costs that get passed along to consumers. That's the definition. That's what economists, real economists, use when they study this stuff. He set the document down gently. It was a syllabus. AOC could see the header even from across the table. Introduction to Macroeconomics, Boston University, Fall 2008, her freshman economics course. The course where inflation was defined on day 3. Kennedy wasn't done. Now I pulled your college transcript. He produced another document, this one looking official, stamped, the kind of thing that required FOIA requests and patience. It's public record available because of your congressional internship application back in the day. Freedom of Information Act is a beautiful thing when you know how to use it. And I see here you took Introduction to Macroeconomics. Good start. Introduction to Microeconomics your sophomore year. Also good. And then he flipped a page, made a show of counting. 1 upper-level economics elective your junior year. That's 3 economics courses total for your economics degree. He looked up, his eyebrows raised in theatrical confusion. That seems light, doesn't it? I mean, I went to Vanderbilt and then Oxford and I had trouble with long division, but even I know that 3 courses don't make a major. So I pulled Boston University's degree requirements. Another document. Says here an economics major requires a minimum of 12 economics courses, econometrics, advanced micro and macro theory, monetary policy, international economics. Heavy quantitative work. You took 3 courses, and your degree, he tapped the transcript, is technically in economics and international relations, with a heavy emphasis on the IR side. AOC felt her face getting hot. This was public record, yes, but presented this way, in this context, it sounded damning. She'd taken other courses, relevant courses. Social science wasn't just about equations and graphs. Kennedy pulled out another page. And that Introduction to Microeconomics course, the one where you learned supply and demand curves, market equilibrium, marginal cost, how prices actually work in a market economy, you got a C+, ma'am. The room was so quiet now that AOC could hear her own breathing, could hear someone in the back shifting weight from one foot to another, could hear Kennedy's papers rustling as he arranged them in front of him like a prosecutor laying out evidence. Now, Kennedy continued, his voice still friendly, still dripping with that false humility that made every word cut deeper. I'm not saying a C+ is terrible. I got a C+ in statistics at Vanderbilt, and I still managed to graduate. But here's the thing, Representative. I don't go around proposing to redesign the entire statistical system of the United States based on that C+. That would be crazy. That would be like me deciding I understand statistics better than actual statisticians because I barely passed one class. You see the problem. AOC tried to interrupt, tried to steer this back to policy, to the actual issues. But Kennedy raised a hand, polite but firm. We'll get to policy. We'll get to your ideas. But I think it's important we establish your credentials first, since you've built your entire brand on being an economics expert. So, after college, you became an economist, right? Went to work for a firm, maybe the Federal Reserve, maybe a university research department, somewhere you could apply that Boston University economics degree. Silence. AOC knew where this was going. Oh, that's right, Kennedy said, snapping his fingers like he'd just remembered. You became a bartender, which is honest work. My daddy owned a small business, and honest work is honest work. I respect it deeply. But representative tending bar isn't the same as working in economics. You didn't become an economist. You didn't work in finance. You didn't even become an accountant. You poured drinks, which requires different skills: customer service, multitasking, dealing with drunk people. All valuable, but not economics. He leaned back in his chair, getting comfortable. So let me make sure I understand your credentials. You took 3 economics courses in college, got a C+ in the most important one, never worked a single day in any economics-related field, and now you're proposing to restructure the entire American economy with plans costing tens of trillions of dollars. Ma'am, with respect, I wouldn't let you restructure my sock drawer based on those credentials, much less a $20 trillion economy. AOC found her voice. Economics isn't just about formulas and graphs, Senator. It's about people. It's about understanding how policies affect working families, how systems of power operate, how wealth gets distributed and concentrated. You can't reduce it to just mathematical models. I completely agree, Kennedy said immediately, and his agreement somehow felt more dangerous than his attacks. Economics is absolutely about people. About real people who lose their jobs when politicians who barely passed Econ 101 implement policies they don't fundamentally understand. You're right that it's not just math. It's also history, psychology, sociology, politics. Which is why people who make economic policy should have, at minimum, a basic understanding of how economies actually function. Not just the social aspects, the mechanical aspects, the boring parts with the graphs and the equations that you got a C+ in. He pulled out more papers. The box seemed bottomless. But let's talk about your understanding of policy. Let's discuss some of your greatest hits and see how that C+ has served you in Congress. Because that's what really matters, right? Not college grades, real-world results. Kennedy was building something. AOC could feel it. This wasn't just an attack on her credentials. This was the foundation. He was establishing her as unqualified, unknowledgeable, out of her depth. And once that foundation was set, everything else would crumble easier. The moderator tried to interject, something about moving to the policy questions, but Kennedy ignored him. When a United States senator wants to keep talking, moderators don't have much power to stop him, especially when everyone in the room is leaning forward, fascinated by the demolition in progress. Let's start with something simple, Kennedy said. Something that happened in your district, something you celebrated. Amazon HQ2, you remember that? Of course she remembered. It was one of her early victories, one of the moments that established her as a fighter, someone willing to stand up to corporate power. She'd helped kill the deal that would have brought Amazon to Queens, and she'd done it because the deal was corporate welfare, billions in tax breaks for the richest company in the world. Kennedy pulled out a document, of course he did. The box was probably organized like a lawyer's file system, everything indexed and cross-referenced. Amazon was going to build a headquarters in Long Island City. 25,000 jobs, they said, with an average salary of $150,000. The state and city offered $3 billion in tax incentives over 10 years. You opposed this deal. You fought against it. You celebrated when it fell apart. Called it a victory for working people. He looked up. Can you explain to me and to everyone here what a tax incentive actually is? AOC had been through this debate 1,000 times. Tax incentives are when the government gives away taxpayer money to corporations. In this case, we were going to give Amazon $3 billion that could have been spent on schools, infrastructure, housing for working families. Instead, we were handing it to Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world. Kennedy's smile got wider. This was what he'd been waiting for. Representative, with respect, that answer proves my point better than anything I could say. That answer, right there, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how tax incentives work. And that misunderstanding cost your constituents 25,000 jobs. He stood up, walked to a whiteboard that had been set up in the corner. Someone handed him a marker. He was going to use props. This was about to get worse. Let's do this simply because this is important. Let's say Amazon is deciding where to put their headquarters. They're looking at New York, they're looking at Virginia, they're looking at Texas. Now, if Amazon doesn't come to New York, how much tax revenue does New York get from Amazon? Zero, someone in the audience said. Zero, Kennedy repeated, writing it on the board. If Amazon isn't in New York, New York collects zero tax dollars from Amazon. Zero jobs. Zero economic activity. Zero. Everyone with me so far? Heads nodded. AOC stayed silent. Now, if Amazon comes to New York, they're going to generate revenue. They're going to make money. And when companies make money, they pay taxes. Corporate income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, all kinds of taxes. The economists who studied this deal, real economists with better than C+s, estimated that Amazon would generate approximately $27 billion in tax revenue over 10 years. He wrote $27 billion on the board. The tax incentives were $3 billion over 10 years. So if we do the math, 27 billion minus 3 billion equals 24 billion. That's a net gain of $24 billion. Money that could go to schools, infrastructure, all those things you mentioned. Kennedy turned to face AOC. But you genuinely thought, that the $3 billion in tax incentives was money sitting in a bank account. You thought New York had $3 billion in cash that they were going to hand to Amazon in a giant check. But that's not how tax incentives work, Representative. Tax incentives mean Amazon pays less in taxes than they otherwise would. The key words are than they otherwise would. If Amazon doesn't come, New York gets zero. If Amazon comes with incentives, New York gets 24 billion. Some is more than zero. He walked back to the table, set down the marker. You killed a deal that would have netted your city $24 billion because you didn't understand what a tax incentive is. That's not a policy disagreement. That's not a different economic philosophy. That's failing to understand basic concepts. AOC started to respond, to talk about gentrification and community impact and corporate power. But Kennedy wasn't finished. And it gets worse. Those 25,000 jobs at an average salary of $150,000, that's $3.75 billion in annual wages, just from direct Amazon employment. The economists estimated another 67,000 indirect jobs. Restaurants, dry cleaners, coffee shops, construction, all the businesses that support a major employer. Total economic impact was estimated at over $80 billion over 25 years. He pulled out a map of New York City. You know what happened after you killed the deal? Amazon still opened facilities in New York, just not in your district. Staten Island got a facility. The Bronx got one. Your constituents got nothing except higher unemployment and the knowledge that their representative didn't understand the difference between a tax incentive and a government check. Kennedy's voice dropped lower, more serious. Representative, $150,000 a year isn't rich in New York City. That's a teacher married to a firefighter. That's 2 nurses. That's working families who could have bought homes, sent kids to college, built lives. But you called them jobs for the rich, and you killed them because you failed to understand economics 101. The room was completely silent now. Even people who disagreed with Kennedy politically couldn't argue with the math. The Amazon deal had been a disaster for Queens, and everyone knew it. But hearing it laid out this methodically, with this level of detail, made it impossible to spin or deflect. AOC's face was red. Her hands were clenched in her lap. She was a fighter. She'd built her brand on being a fighter, but she was fighting someone who had every receipt, every document, every piece of evidence carefully organized in a cardboard box. Kennedy sat back down, took a sip of water. Let's move on to your legislation. Let's talk about the Green New Deal. And AOC knew with absolute certainty that this was going to get much, much worse. Kennedy pulled out a thin document. This is the Green New Deal, all 14 pages of it. Took me about 8 minutes to read. I've read Chinese food menus that were more detailed. I've read furniture assembly instructions with more specific implementation plans. He flipped through the pages. This document promises to make America carbon neutral in 10 years, guarantee jobs for everyone who wants one, provide universal health care, free college, rebuild every single building in America to meet green standards. That's ambitious. That's bold. That's also completely insane. AOC started to object, but Kennedy held up the document. What's interesting is what's not in here. There's no cost estimate, not even a rough one, not even a this might cost somewhere between this amount and that amount. Just promises. Beautiful, inspiring promises with no numbers attached. He pulled out more papers. So I asked some economists to estimate the cost. The American Action Forum said 51 trillion over 10 years. The Heritage Foundation said 93 trillion. Even liberal think tanks estimated at least 40 trillion. Let's split the difference and call it 70 trillion. That's $7 trillion per year for 10 years. Kennedy wrote numbers on his legal pad, holding it up so people could see. The entire federal revenue for 2023 was about $4.4 trillion. That's everything. Income taxes, corporate taxes, payroll taxes, everything the government collects. Your plan costs more per year than the entire federal government takes in. So here's my question, Representative. How do you pay for it? We tax billionaires, AOC said, finding her footing. This was her territory. We close corporate loopholes. We stop wasteful military spending. We restructure the economy to work for everyone, not just the wealthy. Kennedy nodded like a teacher listening to a student who's trying hard but missing the point. Let's do the math on that. Total wealth, not income but total accumulated wealth, of all American billionaires combined is approximately $4.5 trillion. If we confiscated all of it, every single penny, leaving them completely destitute, we could fund your plan for about 7 months. Then what? He continued before she could answer. Corporate tax loopholes. If we closed every single one, we might generate an extra $100 billion a year. Maybe. Military budget is about $700 billion, and you're not actually proposing to eliminate it entirely, just reduce it. So maybe we get $200 billion from military cuts. We're still short about $6 trillion per year. Where's that coming from? AOC started talking about modern monetary theory, about how the government could simply print money, how deficits didn't matter the way traditional economists claimed, how economic transformation required bold thinking beyond conventional budget constraints. Kennedy let her talk, let her dig deeper. Then, when she finished, he pulled out more documents. Modern monetary theory. That's the idea that governments that control their own currency can never run out of money because they can just print more. And that's technically true. You can print infinite money. You know what happens when you print money without corresponding increases in productivity? Inflation. Real inflation, not the corporate greed kind you mentioned earlier. The kind where the money in people's pockets becomes worthless. He pulled out historical examples. Weimar Germany printed money. Inflation hit 3.25 million%. Zimbabwe printed money. Inflation hit 89.76 billion%. That's a real number. Venezuela printed money. Their economy collapsed. These aren't theoretical examples, Representative. These are real countries where people suffered because politicians who didn't understand economics decided they could just print money to solve problems. Kennedy's voice got harder. But even the money isn't the most ridiculous part. Let's talk about the logistics. Your plan promises to retrofit or rebuild every building in America to meet green standards. There are approximately 136 million buildings in America. You want to do this in 10 years. That's 3,650 days. He did the math on his pad. That means retrofitting or rebuilding 37,000 buildings per day, every single day, for 10 straight years. No weekends, no holidays, 37,000 buildings per day. Representative, there aren't enough construction workers in America to do that. There aren't enough materials. The supply chains don't exist. The training programs don't exist. You can't just wave a wand and create an entire industry overnight. He pulled out more documents. You also promised to eliminate air travel and replace it with high-speed rail. The distance from New York to Los Angeles is 2,800 miles. The fastest high-speed rail in the world in China goes about 200 miles per hour. That's a 14-hour train ride. Nobody is taking a 14-hour train when they can fly in 5 hours. You're not eliminating air travel. You're eliminating business travel, tourism, and family visits. Kennedy held up a map of the United States. You'd need to build about 30,000 miles of high-speed rail to make this work. In 10 years, that's 8 miles of track per day. China, with an authoritarian government, unlimited cheap labor, and no environmental reviews, builds about 1,000 miles per year. You think America is going to build 3 times faster while dealing with union labor, environmental impact statements, and local zoning boards. He set down the map. Your plan requires solar panels covering an area larger than Texas, battery storage technology that doesn't exist at any useful scale, a complete transformation of the transportation system, training 20 million construction workers overnight, and spending more money than exists in the federal budget. This isn't a policy proposal, Representative. This is a fever dream. This is what happens when someone watches too many superhero movies and thinks they can redesign reality by force of will. AOC tried to fight back. We have to be ambitious about climate change. We're facing an existential crisis. We can't afford to think small. There's ambitious and there's delusional, Kennedy said flatly. Ambitious is Kennedy going to the moon. We knew the physics. We had a plan. We understood the costs. We built the technology step by step. That was ambitious. What you're proposing is delusional. You're promising to eliminate airplanes, rebuild every building in America, and transform the entire economy in 10 years with no plan for how to pay for it, no technology to do it, and no workers trained to build it. You wrote a wish list and called it legislation. He gathered the Green New Deal papers. This document, Representative, is proof that you don't understand economics, logistics, engineering, or reality. And the fact that it got any support at all is a damning indictment of how we've prioritized Twitter popularity over actual policy expertise. Kennedy reached back into his box. He still had more. Of course he did. Let's talk about your personal finances, he said, and AOC's stomach dropped. When you were elected in 2018, your financial disclosure showed you had about $15,000 in savings. That was it. You were living paycheck to paycheck, working as a bartender, genuinely representing the working class experience. I respect that. That's real. He pulled out more recent financial disclosures. But now you make $174,000 a year. That's a congressional salary. That's good money. That puts you in the top 10% of American earners. You are, by definition, rich. Not billionaire rich, but rich. You make more than 90% of Americans. Kennedy pulled out photos. They appeared to be printed from social media. And you live like you're rich. You drive a Tesla, Model 3 nice car. Base model starts around $40,000, but the one you have, with the features I can see in these photos, probably cost closer to $50,000. You maintain an apartment in D.C. where rent runs $3,000 to $4,000 a month. You maintain a residence in New York, which isn't cheap. You wear designer clothes to events. You get professional hair and makeup for appearances. He started adding numbers on his legal pad. Your required expenses probably run $8,000 to $10,000 a month. That's $96,000 to $120,000 per year, plus taxes. You're paying about $40,000 in federal and state income taxes. So out of your $174,000 salary, you're spending about $160,000 on lifestyle and taxes. That leaves maybe $14,000 a year for savings. Kennedy looked up. Yet you went from $15,000 in savings to owning a $50,000 Tesla in 4 years. The math doesn't work unless there's income we're not talking about. He pulled out another document, book deals, speaking fees. You wrote a book about being working class while making more than 90% of Americans. That book made you money. You get paid to speak at events. You're monetizing your brand, which is fine. That's capitalism. That's the American dream. But you can't be rich and pretend you're poor. You can't drive a luxury car and claim to represent people riding the bus. You can't make more than 9 out of 10 Americans and call yourself working class. AOC tried to interrupt. I came from a working class background. I understand the struggles. And now you're rich, Kennedy said. Past tense, Representative. You were working class, you understood struggles. But now you make $174,000, drive a Tesla, live in expensive neighborhoods in 2 of the costliest cities in the country, and enjoy the benefits of capitalism while claiming to oppose it. You can't have it both ways. Either you're rich or you're working class. Pick one. He pulled out more photos. And here's the thing that really bothers me. You went to the Met Gala. September 2021. Wore a beautiful white dress with "Tax the Rich" written on it in red letters. Made quite a statement. Very Instagram-friendly. Kennedy held up the photos so everyone could see. AOC in her gown, surrounded by celebrities and photographers, looking every bit like someone who belonged at a $35,000 per ticket event. Tickets cost $35,000. The designer dress, custom-made by Aurora James, estimated value based on similar pieces, $60,000 to $80,000. Professional hair and makeup, several thousand. Accessories, let's call it $5,000. Total value of gifts you received that night, approximately $100,000. He pulled out IRS documentation. The IRS has rules about gifts. Anything over $15,000 in value has to be reported as income and is taxable. I've looked at your financial disclosure forms for 2021, public record for members of Congress. I don't see any reporting of these gifts. The tax liability on $100,000 of income at your tax bracket would be about $35,000 to $40,000. Kennedy set down his papers. Did you pay taxes on this gift, Representative? Silence. The room held its breath. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You wore a Tax the Rich dress to a $35,000 per plate party where you rubbed elbows with millionaires and billionaires. You received approximately $100,000 in free goods and services, and you didn't pay taxes on any of it. That's not political protest, ma'am. That's tax evasion with better fashion sense. AOC found her voice. The dress was borrowed for the event. It was returned afterward. The ticket wasn't returned, Kennedy interrupted. The makeup wasn't returned. The experience of attending wasn't returned. And even if the dress was returned, you still received the benefit of wearing an $80,000 dress for an evening. The IRS doesn't care if you gave it back. You received value. That's income. He pulled out opinions from tax attorneys. I asked some experts about this. Real smart folks, not C+ students. They said that if you borrow a $100,000 item for personal use, even temporarily, the IRS considers that a taxable benefit. Like if your employer loans you a luxury car for a weekend, that's taxable compensation. Kennedy smiled that dangerous smile. But I suppose when you're making a statement about taxing the rich, you don't actually have to pay taxes yourself. Rules for thee but not for me, as they say. Very hypocritical. Is that too strong a word? No, I think that's exactly right. The progressive side of the audience looked uncomfortable. The conservative side was eating this up. But more importantly, the moderates, the people who didn't come in with strong opinions, were taking notes, pulling out phones, clearly planning to fact-check everything Kennedy was saying. AOC tried to pivot back to broader issues of wealth inequality, but Kennedy was already moving to his next point. Let's talk about your grandmother, he said, his tone shifting slightly. This one was more personal, and he seemed to know it needed a different approach. After Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, you spoke often about the suffering there. You said your grandmother was living in terrible conditions. Damaged roof, no power, inadequate food and water. You were very emotional about it and it was compelling. People cared. He pulled out printed tweets. June 2021, you tweeted about your grandmother still suffering. You blamed the Trump administration. You called it a disgrace that Americans were living in these conditions. It generated thousands of retweets, a lot of attention. Kennedy pulled out news clippings. Conservative commentator Matt Walsh saw your tweets. He decided to help. He organized a GoFundMe campaign and raised over $100,000 specifically for your grandmother, to fix her roof, restore power, whatever she needed. He contacted your office to arrange delivery of the funds. He looked at AOC. You refused the money. AOC started to speak, but Kennedy continued. Your office said it was a stunt, that it was offensive, that you didn't need help from conservatives. $100,000 in donations from regular Americans who wanted to help your grandmother, and you said no because it came from the wrong people politically. He pulled out more articles. Then reporters went to Puerto Rico to check on your grandmother. You know what they found? The house was fine. Repairs had been done. Your grandmother was living comfortably. She told reporters she was okay, that family had been helping her. Kennedy's voice got harder. So you told America your grandmother was suffering. You blamed the government. You made it a political issue. People offered to help with $100,000 in actual help, and you refused it because accepting would have been politically inconvenient. Then it turned out your grandmother was fine anyway. He set down the articles. You used your own grandmother's suffering, real or exaggerated, for political points. And when actual help was offered, you rejected it because it didn't fit your narrative. That's not advocacy, representative. That's exploitation. You turned your family into a political prop. AOC tried to defend herself, talking about the broader crisis in Puerto Rico, but Kennedy interrupted. By lying about your grandmother's specific situation, by creating a crisis that didn't exist, by refusing help when it was offered. What exactly was the point? Because from where I'm sitting, the point was to get attention for yourself while making your political opponents look bad. You had a choice. Accept help gracefully and show that Americans of all political beliefs care about Puerto Rico. But you chose partisan theater instead. Kennedy gathered those papers and reached back into his seemingly infinite box. Let's talk about where you live in Washington, D.C. AOC's eyes closed briefly. She knew what was coming. You have an apartment in Navy Yard. Luxury building. Very nice. Rooftop pool, fitness center, yoga studio, resident lounge, concierge service. All the amenities. Rent for a one-bedroom in your building runs about $3,000 to $4,000 a month. Two-bedroom is $4,000 to $6,000. That's expensive, but you work hard. You deserve nice things. Kennedy pulled out more information. Your building is new construction, built in 2018. Luxury development. The kind of development you've opposed in your own district. You've called luxury apartments instruments of gentrification. You've said they displace working people and destroy communities, but you live in one. He showed voting records. In 2019, a similar luxury development was proposed in your district. Beautiful building, waterfront, amenities similar to where you live. You opposed it. Said it would gentrify the neighborhood, raise rents, push out working families. The project was blocked. Kennedy looked at her. So luxury apartments are bad in Queens but good in D.C., or are they only bad when other people want to build them? He pulled out more information about her building. Your building has strict security, key fob access, cameras, controlled entry, no homeless shelters nearby. The building management has lobbied against affordable housing developments in the area. You know why? Because luxury building residents don't want affordable housing next door. It might affect property values. Kennedy leaned forward. Did you speak out against that? Did you use your platform to demand your building accept affordable housing nearby? Did you insist on Section 8 vouchers being accepted? Or did you enjoy your rooftop pool in peace? Silence answered him. Your building was also built by non-union construction workers. The development company has a history of fighting unionization. You've said every construction project should be union-only, but you live in a building built by non-union labor. That's convenient. He spread out documents. You live in luxury while opposing it for others. You enjoy amenities while calling them immoral. You benefit from non-union construction while demanding unions for everyone else. You oppose affordable housing near your building while demanding it in your district. That's not socialism, representative. That's limousine liberalism with better branding. Kennedy took a breath. He was building to something. The audience could feel it. AOC could feel it. This wasn't random. This was structured, methodical, leading somewhere. Let's talk about small businesses, Kennedy said, and his voice took on a different quality. The backbone of the American economy. The engine of job creation, the place where most Americans actually work. How do you feel about small businesses, representative? AOC, exhausted and defensive, gave a generic answer about supporting entrepreneurship and small business owners. Kennedy smiled. That's interesting, because your voting record tells a very different story. He pulled out a comprehensive analysis. Since you entered Congress in 2019, there have been 17 bills specifically designed to help small businesses: tax relief, regulatory reform, access to capital, pandemic assistance. You want to guess how many you voted for? He waited. AOC said nothing. 2. You voted for 2 out of 17. That's an 11% support rate for small business legislation. You opposed 15 bills designed to help the people you claim to represent. Kennedy pulled out specific examples. H.R. 1994, the Small Business Relief Act of 2020, provided targeted tax relief for businesses with under 50 employees. You voted no. H.R. 7010, Paycheck Protection Program Extension, helped small businesses keep employees during COVID. You voted no. H.R. 2877, reducing regulations on small business loans. You voted no. He looked up. Why? Why would someone who claims to represent working people vote against helping small businesses? Those bills had poison pills, AOC started. Corporate giveaways. They were targeted at small businesses, Kennedy interrupted. Companies under 50 employees, the bodega on the corner, the family restaurant, the local bookstore. Not corporations, not billionaires, small businesses. And you voted to deny them help. He pulled out devastating data. Let's talk about COVID. During the pandemic, your district lost 3,400 small businesses, permanently closed, gone. You know what stayed open? Target, Walmart, Amazon. The big chains thrived. But the small businesses, the ones that couldn't afford to weather months of closure, they died. Kennedy's voice rose. You supported the lockdowns. You supported keeping businesses closed. You opposed the relief bills that would have helped them survive. You stood by while 3,400 small businesses in your district disappeared. And you know who benefited? The big corporations you claim to oppose. He pulled out economic analysis. You support a $15 federal minimum wage with no exceptions for small business. Economists across the political spectrum agree that would eliminate approximately 1.4 million jobs, mostly at small businesses. You know why? Because Walmart can afford $15 an hour. Target can afford it. Amazon already pays more than that. But the local pizza place can't. The independent bookstore can't. The family dry cleaner can't. Kennedy stood up. You've never run a business, representative. You've never hired anyone. You've never made payroll. You've never stayed up at night wondering how to keep the lights on. You've never had to tell an employee you can't give them a raise because the government just raised your costs. You've never worried about regulations or taxes or competition from corporations with deeper pockets. He pointed at her. But you vote to make it harder for people who do all those things. You vote to raise their costs. You vote to increase their regulations. You vote to help their big corporate competitors. You vote against every bill that would make their lives easier. And you do it while calling yourself a champion of working people. Kennedy's voice got quiet, which made it more powerful. Small businesses aren't just statistics, representative. They're the couple who took out a second mortgage to open a restaurant. They're the immigrant family running a grocery store. They're the single mom who started a cleaning business. They're the American dream in action. And your policies are killing them. He pulled out final data. Your father was a small business owner. He ran an architecture firm. He passed away when you were young, but he understood what it meant to risk everything to build something, to create jobs, to serve a community. And somehow his daughter grew up to become the greatest threat to small business in Congress. Kennedy gathered all his documents, stacking them neatly. You've never run a business. You've never created a job. You've never made anything except speeches. But you've voted to destroy the people who do. You've supported policies that help big corporations while crushing small ones. You've opposed every effort to give small businesses a fighting chance. And you've done it all while claiming to represent the working class. He looked directly at her. The working class doesn't work for billionaires, representative. They work for small businesses, and you're putting them out of business. Kennedy turned to the audience. A $15 minimum wage sounds great until the business closes and everyone makes zero an hour. You know who can afford it? Amazon, Walmart, Target, the big corporations. You know who can't? The bodega on the corner, the family restaurant, the local boutique. You're not helping the working class representative. You're helping Amazon destroy its competition. And you're doing it in the name of socialism. He picked up his final document. This is data from your own district. Since you took office, small business formation is down 37%. Small business closures are up 62%. The number of people employed by small businesses in your district has dropped by 11,000. But Amazon just opened a fulfillment center in Staten Island. Target expanded. The chains are thriving. You've helped big corporations crush small business and you call it progress. Kennedy walked toward the center of the room, commanding everyone's attention. You came here tonight to debate economics, but you can't debate something you don't understand. You got a C+ in Econ 101 and decided you were qualified to redesign the economy. You killed 25,000 jobs in your own district because you don't understand tax incentives. You proposed a $93 trillion plan with no way to pay for it. You drive a Tesla while claiming to be working class. You exploited your grandmother for political points. You live in luxury while opposing it for others. And you've spent 5 years in Congress voting to destroy small businesses. He stood at the moderator's table, looking back at AOC. This wasn't a debate. This was a demonstration of what happens when someone with no expertise, no experience, and no understanding of basic economics gets power. You're not a representative. You're an influencer who stumbled into Congress with a Twitter following and a C+ in econ. Kennedy looked at her one final time. Ma'am, with respect, you're out of your depth. You should stick to social media and leave policy to people who understand math. The room exploded. Half the audience was on their feet applauding. The other half was shouting in outrage. The moderator had completely lost control. Cameras were flashing. Someone's phone was live streaming this to Twitter, and the notifications were already flooding in. AOC sat frozen. Her face was a mixture of shock, humiliation, and fury. Her staff rushed to her side, forming a protective barrier, ushering her toward the exit. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. Looking back would mean acknowledging what had just happened, and she wasn't ready to process that yet. Kennedy calmly packed up his documents, placed them back in the cardboard box, picked up his water glass, and waved to people in the audience like he'd just finished a pleasant conversation about the weather. To him, this was just another day, another argument won, another case made with evidence and logic. Within 90 minutes, video clips were everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. Every platform that existed was saturated with Kennedy destroying AOC. The hashtag C+ in econ was trending worldwide within 3 hours. Memes flooded the internet. Conservative accounts were celebrating. Progressive accounts were scrambling to do damage control, but the evidence was too solid, the arguments too sound, the destruction too complete. The mainstream media tried to figure out how to cover it. CNN, whose think tank had hosted the event, played clips on loop but struggled with the commentary. Their analysts tried to find ways to defend AOC but kept running into the same problem. Kennedy's facts were accurate. His numbers checked out. His arguments were logically sound. Jake Tapper, not present at this event but brought in for analysis, gave a careful statement. What we saw today was Senator Kennedy presenting a detailed, evidence-based critique of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's economic record and proposals. Whether you agree with his politics or not, his preparation was thorough and his arguments were well documented. MSNBC tried to frame it as Republican bullying, as a powerful man attacking a young woman, but that narrative fell apart when they brought actual economists on to fact-check Kennedy's claims. One by one, the economists confirmed his math on the Amazon deal, the Green New Deal costs, the tax incentive calculations. They might disagree with his policy prescriptions, but they couldn't dispute his analysis of hers. Even the Young Turks, usually AOC's most reliable defenders, had trouble with this one. Cenk Uygur spent an entire segment fact-checking Kennedy's claims and kept coming back to the same conclusion. He's right about the numbers. He's right about the Amazon deal. He's right about her voting record. We can disagree with his worldview, but we can't deny the receipts. Jacobin magazine, the premier socialist publication, published a piece titled AOC's Weakness on Economic Policy Exposed: Why the Left Needs Better Arguments. It was brutal, arguing that Kennedy had exploited real gaps in her knowledge and preparation, and that the socialist movement needed representatives who could defend their positions with data and expertise, not just passion and social media savvy. The polls told the most important story. Within a week, AOC's favorability in her district dropped 12 points. Among voters over 50, people who understood how economics actually worked and had been paying taxes for decades, her approval rating cratered to 27%. Among college-educated voters with backgrounds in business or economics, it was even lower. A primary challenger emerged within 72 hours. Maria Santos, a local businesswoman with an economics degree from Columbia and 15 years running a successful chain of restaurants in Queens, announced her candidacy with a pointed message. Our district deserves representation that understands how the economy actually works. The squad tried to rally around AOC. Rashida Tlaib tweeted support, calling Kennedy's approach economic terrorism, which made no sense but played to the base. Ilhan Omar gave a speech about how men in power always try to diminish women, especially women of color, which might have been effective if Kennedy hadn't just spent 2 hours using AOC's own record against her. But even progressive Democrats in Congress quietly distanced themselves. Nancy Pelosi, when asked about the debate, said she hadn't seen it but encouraged all members to be well prepared when discussing complex policy matters. It was the kind of statement that said everything while appearing to say nothing. The real damage came to her legislative agenda. The Green New Deal, already struggling to find co-sponsors, lost the few it had within a week. 3 members withdrew their names, citing concerns about the cost estimates and implementation timeline. The legislation was effectively dead, not because of Republican opposition, but because Democrats didn't want to be associated with it anymore. Her position on the Financial Services Committee came under question. Republicans openly called for her removal, arguing that someone who didn't understand basic tax policy shouldn't be making financial regulations. Democrats didn't defend her. The silence was louder than any attack could have been. Her speaking fees, which had commanded $25,000 per event, evaporated. Universities that had been excited to book her suddenly had budget constraints. Corporate events decided to go in different directions. The premium on her name, the value of her brand, had been severely damaged. But perhaps the most devastating impact was on her personal brand, the carefully constructed image she'd built over 5 years in Congress. She was supposed to be a fighter, a champion who could go toe-to-toe with anyone on economics. Kennedy had systematically destroyed that image using her own record, her own votes, her own lifestyle choices against her. Business schools started using the video as a teaching tool. Professors at Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, schools that rarely agreed on anything, all assigned Kennedy's economics lesson as required viewing. They used it to teach critical thinking, evidence-based argument, and the importance of understanding fundamentals before proposing policy. Conservative organizations turned Kennedy into a folk hero. He'd done what so many others had tried and failed to do, effectively challenged AOC's economic arguments in a format where she couldn't just post a clever tweet and walk away. His coffee cup, the one that said, "I heart suit capitalism," became a bestseller. His office sold replicas online with proceeds going to small business relief funds. They raised over $2 million in 6 months. The legal pad he'd used during the debate was auctioned for charity. It sold for $50,000 to a conservative donor who hung it in his office with a plaque reading, "Evidence Matters." 6 months later, AOC's influence had dramatically waned. She was rarely invited on national television. When she was, she stuck to carefully scripted topics and avoided any discussion of economics. She'd retreated to the safety of social media, where she could control the message and block dissenting voices. Her legislation went nowhere. Bills she proposed died in committee. Co-sponsors were hard to find. Even progressive allies were wary of associating with someone who'd been so thoroughly discredited on economic policy. The primary challenge from Maria Santos was gaining momentum. Santos was running ads featuring clips from the Kennedy debate alongside testimonials from small business owners in the district. We need someone who understands economics, not someone who got a C+ and thinks that makes them an expert. When asked about the debate months later, Kennedy was characteristically modest. I just asked questions and presented facts. If that's controversial, our education system is in worse shape than I thought. Representative Ocasio-Cortez is a talented communicator and a hard worker, but communication doesn't replace competence, and effort doesn't substitute for expertise. The American people deserve representatives who understand the policies they're proposing. But everyone who'd watched knew what had really happened. Kennedy hadn't just won a debate. He'd provided a master class in how to dismantle bad ideas with good evidence, how to expose hypocrisy with humor and grace, how to defend principles with preparation and precision. He'd shown that you don't need to shout or insult to win an argument. You just need to be right, have evidence, and present it clearly. He demonstrated that passion and social media popularity can't substitute for knowledge and competence. He'd proven that eventually, inevitably, the receipts matter more than the rhetoric. Senator John Kennedy did something remarkable that day at the Heritage Foundation. He exposed the difference between social media stardom and actual expertise, between virtue signaling and real understanding, between talking points and policy knowledge. He showed that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for all her communication skills and political instincts, had built her brand on a foundation of economic illiteracy. She'd proposed trillion-dollar plans while failing basic economics. She'd fought for workers while killing their jobs. She'd lived in luxury while claiming to represent the working class. And Kennedy hadn't destroyed her with attacks or insults. He destroyed her with math, documents, and that Louisiana drawl that made every devastating fact sound like friendly advice. The age of style over substance was being challenged. The era of Twitter popularity trumping actual competence was being questioned. Because America deserves representatives who understand the policies they're proposing, not influencers who stumbled into power with a following and a C+ in economics, and absolutely no idea what they're actually doing. The receipts always win eventually. Facts matter. Evidence matters. Competence matters. And on that December day, Senator John Kennedy brought all the receipts, presented all the facts, and demonstrated what real competence looks like when confronting well-intentioned but fundamentally flawed economic thinking. The cardboard box that Kennedy brought that day became symbolic. It represented preparation, documentation, the painstaking work of building an argument on evidence rather than emotion. And when AOC and her supporters tried to dismiss it, tried to frame it as bullying or mansplaining or any of the other deflections that work on social media, they ran into an insurmountable problem. Everything Kennedy said was true. Every document was authentic. Every number checked out. Every argument held up under scrutiny. And you can't defeat truth with rhetoric. You can't overcome facts with feelings. You can't substitute passion for knowledge, no matter how many followers you have or how viral your tweets go. That's the lesson of Kennedy versus Ocasio-Cortez. That's what the debate demonstrated. That's why it mattered beyond partisan politics or ideological divides. Because at some point, governance requires competence. Policy requires knowledge. Leadership requires more than the ability to inspire. It requires the ability to understand. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for all her talents and all her popularity, had built a political career on an economic foundation she never truly understood. Kennedy didn't just expose that foundation as weak. He systematically dismantled it, piece by piece, document by document, until nothing remained but the C+ grade and the uncomfortable truth it represented. She could recover from this. Politicians recover from worse. But it would require something she'd rarely shown: humility, the willingness to admit gaps in knowledge, the commitment to learning rather than performing, the understanding that representing people requires more than relating to them. It requires competence to actually help them. Whether she would learn those lessons remained to be seen. But on that December day at the Heritage Foundation, Senator John Kennedy taught them to everyone watching. And the lesson was clear, unmistakable, and backed by a cardboard box full of receipts. In the end, knowledge beats popularity, evidence beats emotion, and competence matters more than charisma. The age of economic illiteracy in Congress was being challenged. The era of policy by Twitter was being questioned. And Senator Kennedy, with his Southern drawl, his careful preparation, and his devastating effectiveness, had fired the opening shot in that challenge. America was watching. America was learning. And America was starting to demand better from its representatives. Because if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with all her advantages and all her platform, could be exposed this thoroughly, this completely, then maybe competence should matter more than we've been letting it matter. Maybe expertise should count for something. Maybe understanding economics should be a prerequisite for redesigning the economy. Maybe, just maybe, a C+ in Econ 101 shouldn't qualify someone to propose $93 trillion plans. That's what Kennedy proved. That's what the receipts showed. And that's why this debate, this destruction, this master class in evidence-based argument will be studied and referenced for years to come. Because eventually, always, inevitably, the truth matters. And on December 10, 2025, Senator John Kennedy made sure everyone remembered that.